Another response I see to work on Quran and Bible is that the Quran itself says that the scriptures of the Jews and Christians are corrupt, muharraf. I mean, as I'm sure you know, the word tahrif in that form doesn't appear in the Quran, but it does. The Quran does say in a couple of places. I've argued specifically about the Israelites, but open to a response to that. It does says yuharifuna kalima an mawadi'ihi. So something like they change the words from their meanings, but that's taken to mean that phrase and some others too. The Quran speaks about twisting tongues or hiding divine revelation or writing the book with their hands. So there's all this language which seems to speak to at the very least, the poor stewardship of the Jews and Christians, especially the Jews, of divine revelation. But maybe, and then the hadith sort of complete this, that the books which the Jews and Christians have are not to be identified with the Torah and the Gospel as mentioned in the Quran. And so if anyone like Abdulla Galadari shows up and says, hey, look at these really interesting connections between the Bible and the Quran, someone might say, well, the Bible is not the Torah or the Injil. The Quran tells us to beware of the Bible. And so already, like from the very beginning, your work would seem to be invalid.
Yes, you're absolutely correct in saying that, of how some of the Muslim attitudes would be in regards comparing the Quran with the Bible. And that is why in my first book on Quranic hermeneutics, I preempt that in chapter 4, in which I do talk about Tahrif and the relationship between the Quran and the Bible, before I continue and discussing, for example, like the relationship between the Quran and the Gospel of John, for example. The thing is, of course, the yuharrifun in the Quran, what does it really mean? And of course, it has always been debated throughout Muslim tradition, whether it's changing the words itself, is it the changing of the meanings and so forth. And what I argued that, well, yes, maybe those arguments are okay, but if I try to read it closer in those passages in the Quran, like for example, in chapter 5 of the Quran, where it does mention, for example, that there are some of the Jews who yuharrifun, so who do this kind of tahrif. But what is interesting is that just a couple of passages later, just 2 verses later, it says, like, and why do they come to you in judgment when they have the Torah where they're in it is God's judgment? So wait a minute. I mean, if just 2 passages earlier it says yuharrifun, and if we understand that they either change the meaning or change the words, why does it immediately say, like, just 2 verses later, why do they come to you when they have the Torah? Now, even if I look at it from the Muslim tradition, when we do open the books of tafsir, for example, what are the circumstances of revelation? Well, they would say, well, basically what happened is, and there are 2 narratives. They're very similar. They're just 2 versions of it, according to the major tafsirs. But one of them is basically saying that there was a Jew who committed adultery, and then they went to the prophet to basically judge on them. The other version is that someone committed, one of the Jews committed murder. But in general, it's the same idea. So basically, they come to the prophet, and the prophet tells them, well, bring the Torah. And they bring the Torah, and according to the tafsir, they would basically say that some of the Jews were trying to hide the passage of the stoning in like the Torah.
Literally, actually holding their hand above the passage.
Yes, that's how it is portrayed in the tafsir. And then the prophet basically tells them, like remove your hand. What does it say there? And then it's the verse of stoning and so forth. So from actually the books of tafsir, we don't see that they changed the meaning, nor do we even see that they changed the words. But we see something else. You see, in the same chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, which actually talks about yuharrifun, later on, it actually says in verse 66 and then also in verse 68, it basically says, وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ أَقَامُوا التَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ, when it talks about the people of the book, and had they observed the Torah and the Gospel. And in verse 68, it says, قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ لَسْتُمْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ حَتَّى تُقِيمُوا التَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ. O people of the book, you stand upon nothing unless you stand upon the Torah and the Injil. So to me, what I see is that, wait a minute, if I really try to understand, you know, the literal Arabic term, يحرفون. يحرفون comes from the root harafa. And from the root harafa, we have inhiraf, which means to sway away. And when we see the words in here like aqamu and tuqimu, which means istiqama, to stand on a straight path, which is the exact antithesis of yuharrifun. It's the exact opposite of yuharrifun. So it is as if the Quran is saying, well, don't, you know, like, don't sway away from the Torah and the Gospel, but stand firmly upon them. So that is how I see yuharrifun. It's because otherwise, I mean, it would make no sense. Just two verses after the yuharrifun, it says, well, they have the Torah where there in it is the judgment of God. And even the tafsir never suggests that they change the meaning nor the words. It's just that they didn't want to follow what's already in there. That's all it is. So that's to me how I interpret it. But of course, it's just, you know, it's just my opinion. And who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, it's very compelling because, I mean, someone could not go to that extra step of making the case from inside the Quran and simply say, you know, either you're going to do academic research or you're not, right? And I've heard people responding to claims of tahrif simply by saying, listen, you're either going to do historical academic research or you're not. If you want to do theology on your own time in your own place. But if you want to enter the academy, then the Quran is a book, Bible is a book, history is history, things have connections, and that's, but it's really interesting that you make an even more compelling case that if you analyze the Quranic material and maybe some of the tafsir too, that there's reason to do Quran and Bible research.